The sole object of the tariff is to tax the produce, and remember, to tax the produce of foreign industry with the view of promoting American industry. For too long, our government has abandoned the American system.
The factories being built in America are huge.
That takes years, and you've said that robots are going to fill those jobs. So those aren't union worker jobs.
It's automated factories, but the key is who's going to build the factories.
The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is.
US President Donald Trump claims that the tariffs that he is imposing on China and countries all around the world will help to reindustrialize the United States, to bring back good manufacturing jobs. However, to believe this, you have to ignore all of the evidence. Numerous studies, including from sources that are sympathetic to Trump and the Republican Party, have concluded that these tariffs will not reindustrialize the US for a variety of reasons. One, the US doesn't have the infrastructure needed to reindustrialize. Two, the US doesn't have the skilled workforce necessary, and Trump is cutting funding for education. Three, the US government doesn't have the capacity to help plan for further industrialization. And four, it would literally take trillions of dollars of investment to bring back manufacturing in the US, and that's simply not plausible. This was the conclusion of a study that was done by economists at the major US bank Wells Fargo. In fact, they argue that the tariffs will probably hurt the US manufacturing sector because there's so much uncertainty and chaos, which means that companies likely will lay off workers and will not invest more in the US. Furthermore, the tariffs have already pushed companies to absorb the costs of some of these tariffs and to pass costs down to consumers, meaning that average working class Americans are going to have to pay more for imported goods, which is going to cause higher inflation, and it's going to lead to a fall in consumption, which could potentially cause an economic recession, or at least a slowdown. Analysts at Wells Fargo wrote, quote, "A meaningful increase in factory jobs does not appear likely in the foreseeable future in our view," end quote. They estimated that to bring US manufacturing back to the level that it was at in 1979, it would take an investment of a minimum of $2.9 trillion, and that is simply not realistic. And I would go further and say that the fundamental problem is that the Trump administration has no industrial policy. This refers to the effort by the government to implement policies that would promote industrial manufacturing through strategic investments in infrastructure and worker training and education and research and development, through subsidies and cheap government loans for strategic industries, and through government planning. China has become the world's largest manufacturing power, responsible for around a third of global manufacturing production, whereas the US economy has deindustrialized over decades. But China did not accomplish this simply by putting on tariffs and then magically its economy industrialized. China had comprehensive plans going back decades. The Communist Party of China, the government of China, still has 5-year plans that it publishes in which it targets specific sectors and says the government is going to direct finance and provide resources and invest in infrastructure to promote these sectors. China's industrial policy has been very comprehensive and very complex. And if you go back decades, you can see very clearly that in the 1970s and 80s, China was first promoting heavy industries, steel, chemical industries, mechanization of agriculture, and then it moved on to promoting high-tech development and the indigenization of industries and provided cheap government loans for these strategic industries. And every few years, China issues another plan targeting specific sectors, not just the central government in Beijing, but also the provincial governments, which all have their own complex industrial policies. A good example of this was back in 2020, when the Chinese government announced the plan for the development of new energy vehicles, electric vehicles, which has been extremely successful. China has become the world leader in the production of EVs. And one of the main reasons that China can do this is because China has a socialist state-directed economy in which the government owns huge parts of the economy, including the financial sector and all the big banks, including the big telecommunications companies and the energy grid, and has invested in great high-quality infrastructure and public transportation. And through state ownership of these parts of the economy, which are run by big state-owned enterprises, SOEs, China has been able to reduce the cost of production, so it makes it as cheap as possible to manufacture goods in China. The reason that China is so competitive in manufacturing is not because of low wages. Wages in China have increased significantly by many times in recent decades, and industrial wages in China are much higher than they are in neighboring countries in Asia. That's not why China is so competitive in manufacturing. It's because the Chinese government invested strategically, planning over many years, targeting all of the sectors of the economy needed to be as competitive and efficient as possible in manufacturing production. This was all driven by clear government policy and planning. The US government does not have any of that, certainly under Trump. But even previously, the Biden administration did try to do very basic industrial policy through the two big landmark pieces of legislation passed under Biden, which were the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and also the CHIPS and Science Act. These offered hundreds of billions of dollars of government support and subsidies and incentives for local manufacturing, especially in high-tech industries and green energy. However, immediately after Donald Trump returned to the White House for his second term in January 2025, he started waging war against these previous policies implemented by Biden and undoing the CHIPS and Science Act and undoing the Inflation Reduction Act, moving away from the very basic baby steps that the US government took toward having some kind of industrial policy. And there are reports that the Trump administration is canceling some of the grants and subsidies offered to produce, for instance, semiconductors, chips, domestically in the United States. But what this shows is that at the end of the day, the Trump administration is not actually going to reindustrialize the US with these policies, which are completely chaotic and they're causing so much uncertainty, which is only making deindustrialization worse. This was exactly the result of a comprehensive survey that was done by CNBC, interviewing many US companies and the Chamber of Commerce and other corporate groups. And they found that Trump's tariffs will not lead to the reshoring of supply chains and manufacturing jobs back in the US. Instead, it will lead to more automation of jobs through robots, and it would lead to significantly higher costs of production and price hikes and inflation and very likely recession. For this survey, CNBC interviewed the US Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Retail Federation, and many other corporate groups. 57% of them said that it's too expensive to manufacture in the US and they're not going to reshore manufacturing domestically. 21% of them said that the top problem in the US is there simply is not the kind of skilled manufacturing workers necessary to produce these advanced goods. Only 14% said that taxes in the US are a problem. And Trump is continuing to cut corporate taxes, thinking that it's going to bring back manufacturing. And these companies are saying, no, taxes are not the problem. 41% said it would take at least 3 to 5 years to build a new supply chain in the US. An additional 33% said it would take longer than 5 years to create a new supply chain. And then in terms of bringing back manufacturing jobs, 81%, the vast majority, said that if they were to actually bring back manufacturing domestically in the US, 81% would use robots, automation. So Trump's claim that reindustrialization is going to bring back all these jobs is simply not true. In fact, ironically, what's more likely is that Trump's tariffs will cause a recession and hurt manufacturing. 47% of these companies interviewed by CNBC said that they're planning layoffs, laying off workers. 89% said they're canceling orders. And 61%, the majority, said they're going to raise prices, again, causing inflation. 63% of these corporate groups that were interviewed said that they now predict a likely recession in the US because of Trump's tariffs. And they concluded that the most likely outcome of these tariffs is, quote, higher prices, job losses, product shortages, and bankruptcies, end quote. So again, if you look at the evidence, it's clear that Trump's policies are not going to work. And by the way, another important detail to point out is that Trump claims that he'll use tariff revenue to replace income lost through cutting taxes on the rich and corporations. But if you look back to Trump's first term as president, 92% of the revenue that the US government got from tariffs went to providing subsidies for US farmers who were angry because they lost a lot of their sales to China because Trump started a trade war on China. So Trump's tariffs did not actually increase net revenue for the US government, which is why under Trump in his first term, the US government debt and deficit as a percentage of GDP increased significantly, and that was even before the pandemic. And by the way, Trump has repeatedly claimed he's going to reduce the US deficit and bring down the big US government debt. But in reality, his enormous tax cuts on the rich and on corporations are going to significantly increase the US deficit and debt. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office did a study that found that Trump's tax cuts on the rich and corporations will result in an increase in the US government deficit and eventually debt over the next decade by $3.8 trillion. And this is why Trump's emphasis on tariffs is actually completely contradictory, because Trump claims simultaneously that his tariffs will help to reindustrialize the US, but he also claims that he's going to use tariffs to provide revenue for the US government. But those two things cannot exist in the long term. They're totally contradictory, because if Trump's tariffs actually reindustrialize the US, and again, all of the evidence shows that they're not going to do that, but let's say they actually do, well, then that means that the US is no longer going to import goods, and instead those goods will be produced domestically by US companies, which means that the US government will no longer get the tariff revenue from taxing those imports. So Trump cannot replace the income tax with tariff revenue if he actually plans on reindustrializing the US. Those policies are completely contradictory. And by the way, despite all of Trump's promises about bringing back manufacturing, you know what happened during his first term as president from 2017 to 2021? The manufacturing share of US GDP continued to fall. Deindustrialization continued to get worse under Trump when he was president the first time. And a lot of evidence suggests that under Trump's second term, deindustrialization is only going to continue to get worse, not better. I went through data from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, and it shows that in the 1950s and 60s, in the kind of golden era of the US economy, over 1/4 of GDP came from manufacturing. And that figure fell drastically, especially starting in the 1980s with the kind of neoliberal free market right-wing economic policies of Ronald Reagan. And later, those kinds of policies were continued not only by Republicans, but also by Democrats. And it's very important to note that at the same time that the manufacturing sector was declining in its overall share of the US economy, there was an explosion in the growth in the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the FIRE sector. This is Wall Street. In the early 1950s, the FIRE sector only represented around 10% of US GDP. As of the 2020s, it's over 20%, and it continues to grow more and more. And the other sectors of the economy that have become larger and larger include things like professional and business services, which, are lawyers and corporate managers and consultants. And also there's been a big growth in privatized for-profit education and privatized for-profit healthcare. And yes, part of that is because of an aging population, but it's also because more and more of these services that should be publicly provided by the government, like healthcare and education, have been gutted, and instead, they're more and more provided by private for-profit companies for rich people. So Trump has this idea that he can magically reindustrialize the US by simply using tariffs, but that's not how any major economy industrialized, including, ironically, the United States itself. Because in the 18th century, when the US was growing economically very rapidly and trying to catch up to the British Empire, there were a series of US economists who were protectionists and US politicians like Henry Clay of the Whig Party, and they advocated something known as the American system. This was known as the American School of Economics, which had its origins in the first Secretary of the Treasury of the US, who was Alexander Hamilton. And what they recognized is that in order for the US to catch up industrially with the British Empire and the more advanced European industrial powers, the US government had to make plans and provide significant investment and support to promote domestic manufacturing. And yes, it is true that protective tariffs were part of this program, but only one part of a larger program. The three main parts of the American system were: one, US government investment in infrastructure, which they referred to as internal improvements. That means the government building roads and canals and bridges. And I would also add education and worker training and research and development, because of course, industry is much more complicated today than it was in the 18th century. Trump is not doing any of this. He's cutting government spending on investment in infrastructure and public goods. That was the first part of the American system. The second was the creation of a national bank, that is, state discipline and control over the financial sector, over Wall Street. Trump is doing the exact opposite of that. If you look at the people in the Trump administration who are overseeing his economic and trade policy, they're billionaires from Wall Street. They're not going to go against the interests of Wall Street, which would hurt their own financial interests as billionaire financiers. So there is no attempt by the Trump administration to have a national bank and to exercise state control over finance that could provide cheap loans to strategic industries, which is what China does. And not just China, this is what many other East Asian economies did, like Japan and South Korea when they were going through their fast industrial catch-up period. Those are two of the three parts of the American system advocated by Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay and others, especially associated with the Whig Party in the 18th century. Again, one, internal improvements, that is, investment in infrastructure and public goods. Two, national banking. And then three, yes, protective tariffs to help promote infant industries that can't compete internationally. Tariffs were part of this program, but Trump is ignoring the other two parts of the program. And by the way, it was also Abraham Lincoln who promoted the famous American system back in the 1830s. Abraham Lincoln famously said, quote, "I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff," end quote. He mentioned the tariffs last. So yes, they were part of the program, but you can't implement the program without implementing all of it. If you focus on just one, it's not going to work. And what's ironic is back in his first term as president, Trump acknowledged the existence of the American system as it was known, and he talked about Henry Clay, and he praised Henry Clay.
Clay was a fierce advocate for American manufacturing. He wanted it badly. He knew all the way back, early 1800s, Clay said that trade must be fair, equal, and reciprocal. Boom.
However, listen to Trump's words here from a speech he gave back in 2017, and you'll hear how he erases the other parts of the American system and only focuses on tariffs.
In explaining his American system, Clay argued that the sole object of the tariff is to tax the produce, and remember, to tax the produce of foreign industry with the view of promoting American industry. For too long, our government has abandoned the American system.
So what Trump is essentially trying to do is to combine the neoliberal economics of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher with protectionism, taking out all of the government planning and industrial policy and only keeping the tariffs, while at the same time acting as though the free market and US corporations will voluntarily reindustrialize the US. Ignoring that one of the main reasons for the financialization of the US economy is because manufacturing is not as profitable. This is why US capitalists have preferred investing in the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the FIRE sector, because it's much easier to get higher returns. It's much more profitable than investing in manufacturing, which is risky and has lower returns. But just like Ronald Reagan, who ushered in a new era of financialization and deindustrialization of the economy, Trump thinks that he can just magically reindustrialize the US by cutting taxes on the rich. And this is exactly what he's doing through his so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which will result in enormous tax cuts on the richest Americans, while effectively raising taxes on the poorest Americans. This is extremely regressive. It's essentially a form of class war. But the government is not implementing any policies that would incentivize or force the rich to invest in manufacturing instead of investing in financial assets. Because the reality is that for many years now, US corporations have stopped investing. This is another big reason for the deindustrialization of the US economy. Because again, the financial sector is much more profitable. This is why the vast majority of the net income, which we popularly would call the profits, the vast majority of the net income of US corporations goes into buying back their own stocks and paying dividends to shareholders, because that's the way they can pump up their own stock. This is what CEOs are incentivized to do because they get paid more bonuses based on how high the stock price is, not based on how much they contribute to manufacturing employment and manufacturing production. These are exactly the kinds of policies that famously led General Electric, GE, to become a financial company. This was under the infamous CEO Jack Welch, who recognized that if GE just became a financial firm, then it would be much more profitable. And what happened is many other companies followed the same model. And there are so many people trained in business programs, MBAs, these finance bros, who are churned out of business schools, and they take over companies like Boeing, and they destroy the companies by financializing them, and then their planes start falling out of the sky, which is exactly what's happened to Boeing. Boeing used to be run by engineers. It was taken over by MBA finance bros. So fundamentally, the point I'm getting at here is that there is a deep, irreconcilable contradiction between the interests of Wall Street, the financial capitalist class in the US, and the industrial sector. And yet, Trump's administration, his economic policies, are not being designed by people with experience in manufacturing. Again, the people running Trump's economic and trade policy are billionaires from Wall Street. Trump's Treasury Secretary is the billionaire hedge fund manager, Scott Bessent, who got his start working for George Soros, the infamous billionaire speculator, who ironically is seen as the big boogeyman of the Republican Party. But at the end of the day, the US capitalist class is an elite club of these rich billionaires like Trump himself, and that's why he picked one of George Soros's closest allies to run his economic policy. And again, Trump's Commerce Secretary is another billionaire from Wall Street, Howard Lutnick. Lutnick was the CEO of the major Wall Street financial firm Cantor Fitzgerald. And this is not invested in manufacturing production. In fact, it's invested in real estate and the financial sector and in cryptocurrency, which, by the way, there are so many conflicts of interest and corruption there. But again, not manufacturing. And it's obvious that this billionaire Howard Lutnick does not actually understand manufacturing. And this was made clear when he did an interview on CBS News. And he was asked about the Trump administration's plans to supposedly bring back manufacturing jobs. And his answer was completely contradictory. He claimed that trillions of dollars of factories are going to be built in the US and create all of these jobs. And then a few seconds later, he said that those jobs are going to all be automated by robots, not actually by manufacturing workers. So which is it? Is the Trump administration going to bring back manufacturing jobs, or are robots going to do those jobs? Listen to what is said here by Donald Trump's billionaire commerce secretary from Wall Street and how completely contradictory it is.
Trillions of dollars of factories are going to be built in America. That's huge GDP. The factories being built in America are huge.
That takes
GDP.
years. And you've said that robots are going to fill those jobs. So those aren't union
really automated
worker jobs.
It's automated factories, but the key is who's going to build the factories, who's going to operate the factories, who's going to make them work. Great American workers.
You
we
said
are going to
robots
replace
on other
the
networks.
armies of millions of people. Well, remember, the army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to come to America. It's going to be automated, and great Americans, the trade craft of America, is going to fix them, is going to work on them. They're going to be mechanics. There's going to be HVAC specialists. There's going to be electricians. The trade craft of America are high school educated Americans. The core to our workforce is going to have the greatest resurgence of jobs in the history of America to work on these high-tech factories, which are all coming to America.
That clip is so revealing because what it shows is that top officials in the Trump administration realize that they're not actually going to provide millions of manufacturing jobs for Americans. And they're certainly not going to be good paid union jobs because the Republican Party is completely against unions. They're constantly fighting unions. As Howard Lutnick said there, you're not going to actually have Americans working in factories. Instead, they're going to be building the robots, and they're going to have HVAC systems, air conditioning, and they're going to have electricians working on these factories. So that's a small number of jobs working on these robots in these automated factories. That's not going to generate significant employment in the US. And what's also very ironic about all of this is that the Financial Times published a very interesting chart that looked at a survey that was done asking Americans if they thought that the US would be better off if the country were reindustrialized and more Americans worked in manufacturing. And 80% of Americans said the US would be better off. However, in the same survey, they asked Americans if you thought you would personally be better off by working in a factory. And only around 20% of Americans, including around 20% of Republicans, said that they would be better off working in a factory. So pretty much everyone agrees that the US needs to reindustrialize, but very few people want to actually work in those factories. And this is something that is constantly pointed out by US corporations themselves, including Apple, which is the biggest company on earth by market capitalization. And Apple's iPhones, 85% of them are produced in China. And corporate executives at Apple have constantly said over many years that they simply cannot produce their iPhones in the US. And it's not just because of higher wages in the US. It's because the US doesn't have the infrastructure investment and the worker training and the education and the engineering skills needed to actually make these iPhones. The CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, was asked about this back in 2017, nearly a decade ago, by Fortune magazine. And he made it very clear that the reason that Apple produces its iPhones in China is not because of low wages. In fact, wages in China are much higher than in neighboring countries. The reason is because the Chinese government has invested so much in the infrastructure and the human development and the training and education necessary to provide the advanced labor to make these actual manufactured goods. And the US government has not invested in that for decades.
I also went to a company this morning that works on the front-facing camera for us.
Here in Guangzhou.
Here in Guangzhou. And again, highly technical, highly precise, advanced manufacturing. And it's the skill here is just incredible.
On that point, give us an update. I think it was about 2 years ago you said publicly when you were asked, why do you do so much manufacturing in China? You said, we'd love to do it other places, i.e. the United States, but the sheer volume of engineers in China is greater than any other place we might discuss. Is that basically still the case?
Yeah, there's a confusion about China. That, and let me at least give you my opinion. The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is. Like the products we do require really advanced tooling. And the precision that you have to have in tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. You know, in the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields. It's that vocational expertise is very deep, very, very deep here. And I give the education system a lot of credit for continuing to push on that, even when others were de-emphasizing vocational. Now I think many countries in the world have woke up and said, you know, this is a key thing and we've got to correct that. But China called that right from the beginning.
Again, this idea that foreign companies go to manufacture in China because people are paid low wages, it's not true. It's this trope you hear in the US that's often used to criticize China, falsely claiming that people are paid starvation wages. It's false. In reality, manufacturing wages in China are significantly higher than in neighboring countries in Asia. Now, in the 90s, the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, wages in China were relatively low. I mean, they were similar to the wages of its neighboring countries, but today, wages in the industrial sector in China are several times higher than in Thailand and India and Malaysia and the Philippines. And yet China is still so competitive in manufacturing because the government has invested in all of these other public goods, including education, research, infrastructure, telecommunications, the financial sector, all of that is provided by the state through socialization of these public services through state-owned enterprises, and that keeps the cost of production very low. Incomes in China have increased drastically in recent decades. In the late 1970s, the median daily income in China was around $1, lower than neighboring countries in Asia. As of 2022, the median income in China is now $15. Literally, the median income in China has increased by 15 times in the past 45 years. It's remarkable. And by the way, it's not just China. Another up-and-coming major industrial power in Asia is Vietnam. And similarly, in Vietnam, there's been a huge growth in the median income in recent years. And yet at the same time, a lot of foreign companies have been moving to Vietnam in order to produce manufactured goods, including some companies are moving out of China into Vietnam because they're afraid of US tariffs. It's not because wages are so low. It's because Vietnam also has a socialist government that is ruled by a communist party. It actually has a system that's very similar to China's system. China's system is officially known as a socialist market economy. Vietnam's system is officially called a socialist-oriented market economy, and they're following a very similar model in which the government, the Vietnamese government, like the Chinese government, has state-owned enterprises that provide public goods, public services at a low cost, not for profit, and then the government invests significantly in infrastructure, in worker training, and education, and telecommunications, and healthcare, and all of this to make the cost of production as low as possible. This is why so many companies are manufacturing in China and Vietnam. And yet the US government is not implementing any of those kinds of state-directed policies that would be needed to actually reindustrialize. Instead, Trump is going to rely on tariffs to magically reindustrialize, saying we're going to put tariffs on and US corporations will simply be motivated by the free market and their own corporate interests to reindustrialize. It's not going to happen. This ignores all of the evidence. The only person in the Trump administration who actually has experience in manufacturing is Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire, the CEO of Tesla, although Tesla is actually more of a financialized company than anything else. Tesla only produces a small fraction of the cars manufactured by competitors like Toyota. And yet Tesla's stock price is so insanely cartoonishly overvalued that in recent years, Tesla's market cap has been larger than numerous huge car manufacturers combined, including Toyota and Volkswagen and GM and Ford and BMW, and also BYD, the major Chinese company, which is now the world's #1 producer and seller of electric vehicles. And BYD overtook Tesla, selling more EVs in Europe. And yet Tesla's stock market capitalization is significantly larger than BYD's, because Tesla is not really a car company so much as it is a financial company that makes some cars, just like how General Electric, GE, started as a manufacturing company and then it basically became a financial firm. This is the path that many US corporations have taken because it was much more profitable. And unless the US government takes policies to go against Wall Street and the capitalist class, it has to actually implement state-directed policies, planning, targeting strategic sectors, saying we are going to develop this industry. And yet we have not seen any government willing to do that. Certainly not Donald Trump and the Republicans that are completely dedicated to Wall Street. I mean, the Democrats have also been completely dedicated to Wall Street. I'm not saying that it's just the Republicans, but the point I'm getting at is that until they're willing to take on these corporate oligarchs, we're not going to see the reindustrialization of the US. If the government truly wanted to reindustrialize, and I've made it clear, again, I think the US needs to reindustrialize. It would be good for the people of the US, but in order to do so, there are concrete policies that the government could take. Here is just an example of a few of them. 1, the most important, industrial policy and planning. 2, significant state investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, the energy grid, public transportation, and more. 3, the government could tax financial transactions to discourage unproductive financial speculation and instead encourage productive investment in manufacturing. Of course, this would anger Wall Street more than anything else. Taxing financial transactions would make a lot of speculation on Wall Street unprofitable. And many of these financial firms, let's not forget, they fund politicians in the US because bribery is essentially legal in the US. The vast majority of politicians with more campaign contributions win elections. So they're not going to implement that policy either. The government could also provide subsidies and incentives for strategic industries. I mean, Biden did that mostly because that's the easiest policy, and it can also lead to corruption. You have to be very careful because then what happens is you get these companies that get huge billion-dollar subsidies from the US government, and they don't actually invest significantly in manufacturing. And then another policy is the US government could exercise control over the financial sector to direct lending to strategic industries, which is what China does through its state-owned banks, but it's also what Japan did during the decades of its highest industrial growth in the 1960s and 70s, when the Bank of Japan, the central bank, ordered private banks to provide loans to strategic industries at low interest rates. They were given quotas as part of a state-directed policy known as window guidance. Still today, this is what China does with its own state-owned banks. It's also what South Korea did in the 1960s and 70s during its high years of industrial growth. But again, in order to do that, the government would have to go against the interests of capital. And we have seen again and again that the Republicans and the Democrats are controlled by big capital. Politicians are funded by big corporations and Wall Street. They're not going to implement these kinds of policies that would be needed to reindustrialize the US, which is why all of the evidence suggests that the US is going to further deindustrialize, while at the same time, the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, will continue growing larger and larger because that's what's profitable for the US capitalist class. If they're not disciplined and controlled by the state, that's what they're going to invest in because it's best for their bottom line. It's really that simple. So I do think that deindustrialization is a big problem in the US. I've been saying this for many years, and obviously I strongly disagree with many of Donald Trump's policies, but I do think that he is right when he recognizes that the US needs to reindustrialize. And I'm not against the idea of tariffs at all. I am not in any way a free marketeer. For many years, I've been criticizing this kind of free market fundamentalism and these neoliberal economic policies. And I also think that neoliberal globalization, the idea that corporations should be able to move anywhere they want, that there should be no restrictions on capital, that capital should be able to freely move across borders, I am against all of that. And I and many people on the left have criticized these policies. I think there should be capital controls. I think there should be significant taxation of financial transactions. And corporations should not be allowed to freely move across borders and offshore and do all of that. By the way, in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, in this kind of golden era that is often romanticized in the US and in Europe, there were significant capital controls and taxes on financial transactions, and it was difficult for capital to move across borders. But Trump is not advocating for a return of any of these kind of state-directed policies because the Republican Party would demonize that as socialism. They would say, you can't tax financial transactions. You can't prevent billionaires from stashing all of their wealth offshore in tax shelters. That's socialism. So instead of returning to those kinds of state-directed policies that would actually be needed to reindustrialize the US, Trump is only focusing on tariffs. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that this is also a kind of policy that is very favorable to big corporate interests and billionaires like Trump and the billionaires who funded his campaign. Because Trump is simultaneously massively cutting taxes, income taxes on the rich, and cutting taxes on corporations, while essentially he's increasing taxes on poor and working class Americans through tariffs. Because what are tariffs? Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. Trump falsely claims, and he repeats ad nauseum, the lie, the falsehood that other countries pay for tariffs. That's not true. Tariffs are paid by US importers, and they disproportionately hurt poor and working class Americans who spend a much larger percentage of their paycheck on imported goods, which include a lot of consumer goods made in countries like China and Vietnam and Bangladesh. And these tariffs are not really going to impact rich people because they have what's known in economics as a lower marginal propensity to consume. If rich people make more money, they're not going to buy many more consumer goods, whereas poor people have a higher marginal propensity to consume. If they have a higher paycheck, they're going to buy more clothes and more cell phones and other consumer goods, which, by the way, are now being taxed at a higher rate because of Trump's tariff. So this is a very regressive form of taxation. And Trump has said many times that he essentially wants to go back to a kind of 19th century style policy of the Gilded Age of robber barons, of William McKinley, his favorite president, before there were income taxes. Trump has floated the idea of cutting income taxes overall, especially on the rich and on corporations, and using tariffs to provide revenue for the government instead of taxes, which again are extremely regressive. This is a kind of class war, removing the burden of taxation on capital and putting the vast majority of the burden of taxation on labor, on poor and working class Americans. So on that note, I'm going to conclude here. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.